March 4, 2022. A cold, quiet night in a small New Mexico town. The streets were alive with the usual sounds of late-night diners and distant traffic, the kind of hum you barely notice when everything feels normal. But on this night, the normalcy was shattered. Behind a bustling diner, tucked away in a shadowy alley, something horrifying was about to unfold. 17-year-old Valentino Harris had been full of life just hours before. He was young, ambitious, and completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. A storm that would end his life and expose secrets no one could have imagined. The first calls to 911 came just after 10 p.m. Gunshots, screams, the sound of chaos breaking the calm. When police arrived, they found Valentino lying motionless on the cold asphalt. 2 gunshot wounds. No sign of the shooter, just an empty alley, blood on the ground, and the lifeless body of a boy who never got to see the future he dreamed of. Valentino's murder shook the town to its core. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's love. And yet, the investigation that followed would turn into something much more twisted than anyone expected. This wasn't just a tragic shooting. This wasn't just a fight that went too far. The truth, when it finally came out, would stun the investigators, tear apart a family, and leave an entire community grappling with one question. Why? This is the story of a mother's dark secret, a family broken by betrayal, and the unimaginable lengths someone went to in order to protect a lie. It's a story of love, anger, and manipulation. And it all started in a dark alley on an ordinary night, where Valentino Harris took his last breath. Valentino Harris was the kind of teenager who left an impression on everyone he met. At just 17 years old, he had a charisma that couldn't be ignored. Teachers described him as respectful, driven, and always ready with a smile. Friends said he was the type of person who would stop to ask how you were doing, who would always have your back when life got tough. His neighbor, Mrs. Gracie Sherman, a retired schoolteacher, recalled how he would help carry her groceries without being asked. Valentino had a good heart, she said. You could see it in the way he treated people. He had this energy, this spark. You just knew he was going to go far. Valentino wasn't just kind. He was talented. Music was his passion. Ever since he was a little boy, he'd been drawn to the rhythm of a beat, the hum of a melody. His mom, Penelope Morton, used to say he could turn anything into an instrument. Pots, pans, even the edge of a desk. By high school, that love for music had grown into a full-blown dream. Valentino had big plans. He wanted to go to college, study music production, and one day produce songs that would be played all over the world. He had this drive, said his band teacher, Mr. Roland Knight. Valentino didn't just play music. He lived it. He had the kind of talent you don't see every day. But what really set him apart was his work ethic. He wasn't afraid to put in the hours, to practice until he got it right. I always told him he could do anything he set his mind to, and I meant it. But Valentino wasn't all about work. He had a fun, playful side too. His friends joked that he had a laugh that could light up a room. Whether it was cracking jokes during lunch or challenging his buddies to a basketball game after school, Valentino had a way of bringing people together. He wasn't just a good student or a talented musician, he was a good friend, the kind of friend who made you feel like you mattered. Then, there was his relationship with Alani Beale. They had been dating for 6 months, but to anyone who saw them together, it was clear their connection ran deeper than most high school romances. Alani was drawn to Valentino's warmth and his unwavering support. He, in turn, admired her intelligence and ambition. They were often seen walking through the hallways hand in hand, sharing inside jokes, or sneaking a kiss when they thought no one was looking. They were young and in love, said one of their classmates. You could tell how much they cared about each other. But their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Valentino came from a family that, by all accounts, loved him deeply but had its fair share of struggles. His mother, Penelope, had a reputation for being overbearing. She wasn't shy about sharing her opinions, and she often clashed with Valentino when it came to the choices he made, especially his relationship with Alani. Those close to Valentino said he often found himself caught in the middle, trying to balance his love for Alani with his loyalty to his family. He wanted everyone to get along, said his best friend, Adon Case. But it wasn't easy. His mom could be intense, you know? She wanted things done her way, and Valentino, he just wanted to follow his heart. Still, Valentino always found a way to stay positive. He was determined to make the best of every situation, no matter how hard it got. That was just who he was. A dreamer, a peacemaker, a kid with the whole world ahead of him. But all of that was stolen from him in a single moment. The tragedy of Valentino's death wasn't just that it happened. It was what he left behind. A grieving girlfriend who lost her first love. Friends who would never again hear his laugh. A family torn apart by secrets and lies. Valentino's life was full of potential, full of promise, full of love. And for those who knew him, the question wasn't just why he died, but why someone would take someone so full of life away from the world. It was a Friday night like so many others in the small New Mexico town. The diner was bustling with the usual crowd. Friends catching up after school, families grabbing a quick bite, and workers stopping in for a late dinner. Among them were 17-year-old Valentino Harris, his girlfriend Alani Beale, and her 16-year-old brother, Ariel Collins. They had planned to grab some food, hang out, and enjoy the night like any other group of teens. But what was meant to be a simple outing would take a devastating turn before the night was over. Witnesses remember seeing Valentino and Alani together at one of the diner's booths. They looked happy, laughing and talking like they always did. Ariel, sitting across from them, appeared more tense. He seemed distracted, keeping an eye on Valentino in a way that didn't go unnoticed. Staff at the diner later recalled overhearing snippets of their conversation, and it wasn't all lighthearted. At some point, voices were raised, and what started as a small disagreement turned into something heated. The details of what happened next remain hazy, but what is clear is that the tension between Valentino and Ariel boiled over. One witness described Ariel standing abruptly, his voice sharp and cutting. Valentino tried to calm things down, but Ariel wasn't backing off. Whatever they were arguing about, it wasn't going to be resolved over a plate of fries. Ariel suggested they take it outside, and Valentino, though reluctant, followed him. Alani trailed behind, begging her brother to let it go. But Ariel was determined. Witnesses remember the three teens heading toward the back exit, disappearing into the shadows of the alley behind the diner. Moments later, the sound of gunshots broke through the night. It's hard to describe the kind of chaos that erupted next. Patrons inside the diner froze at the sound, unsure of what they'd just heard. Someone yelled to call 911. A few brave souls ran toward the alley to see what had happened, their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. When they arrived, they found Valentino lying on the ground. His body was still, his clothes soaked in blood. 2 gunshot wounds, one to his chest, the other to his shoulder. His eyes were closed. There was no pulse. Valentino was already gone. Alani was beside him, sobbing uncontrollably, begging him to wake up. Ariel stood nearby, his face pale, his hands trembling. A few witnesses claimed he was muttering to himself, though the words were incoherent. Others said he simply stood there in silence, as if frozen by what had just happened. When the police arrived, they quickly secured the scene. Officers roped off the alley with yellow tape, the flashing lights of their patrol cars casting harsh shadows on the brick walls. Evidence markers were placed near the shell casings on the ground, and officers began taking statements from witnesses. Ariel was detained almost immediately. He didn't resist. When officers questioned him, he didn't deny being at the scene, but his responses were vague and inconsistent. It didn't take long for him to become the prime suspect. After all, he had been arguing with Valentino moments before the gunshots rang out. He had led him into the alley, and now Valentino was dead. But something about the scene didn't sit right with the officers. The crime felt off. Ariel didn't have a weapon on him when they searched him. His demeanor, while nervous, didn't match the profile of someone who had just pulled the trigger. Witnesses confirmed that the 2 boys had been about to fight, but none of them had actually seen the shooting itself. The coroner's report would later reveal more troubling details. Valentino's injuries suggested he had been shot from a slight distance, not at point-blank range as one might expect in a heated altercation. And while Ariel was covered in sweat and visibly shaken, there were no traces of gunpowder residue on his hands or clothes. As investigators dug deeper into what had happened that night, they began to suspect that this wasn't just a tragic dispute between two teenage boys. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose threads. Who fired the gun? Why? And what exactly had led to the argument in the first place? In the days that followed, Ariel maintained his innocence. He admitted to arguing with Valentino but swore he hadn't pulled the trigger. His family, devastated by the accusations, stood by him, insisting he would never do something like this. But as the police worked to piece together the events of that night, a darker, more twisted version of the truth began to emerge. This wasn't just a fight gone wrong. This wasn't just a crime of passion. The truth about Valentino's murder would turn out to be far more complicated and far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Ariel Collins was the kind of teenager people talked about, but not always in a good way. At 16 years old, he had already earned himself a reputation in the small New Mexico town. Those who knew him would describe him as fiercely protective, especially when it came to his family, but he also had a temper that often got the better of him. He wasn't the type to back down from a confrontation. In fact, he seemed to lean into them. Classmates remembered Ariel as someone who was quick to get into arguments. He wasn't afraid to throw the first punch, and he didn't seem to care much about the consequences. He was hot-headed, said one former classmate. If you said something he didn't like, it didn't matter who you were, he'd make sure you knew it. Teachers had similar stories. Ariel was smart, no doubt about it, but he struggled to keep his emotions in check. Detention slips piled up over the years for things like talking back or getting into fights in the hallways. But for all his faults, Ariel had one redeeming quality that everyone agreed on. He loved his family. His sister, Alani Beale, was his world. They were only a year apart, and growing up, Ariel had always seen himself as her protector. When their father left years earlier, Ariel stepped into that role almost immediately. He was more than just a brother, said a neighbor, Gracie Sherman. He was like a second parent to her in a way. He'd make sure she got home safe, kept an eye on the boys she talked to. He'd do anything to keep her from getting hurt. But sometimes that protectiveness bordered on possessiveness. When Alani started dating Valentino Harris, Ariel wasn't thrilled. At first, it seemed like typical sibling behavior, teasing her about her boyfriend, making sure Valentino knew to stay respectful. But as the relationship grew more serious, Ariel's attitude shifted. Friends noticed that he became more critical of Valentino, nitpicking little things about him. He didn't like how much time Alani was spending with him. He didn't like the way Valentino talked back when Ariel made snide comments. It was clear that Ariel saw Valentino as a threat, not just to his sister, but to the tight bond he shared with her. So when the fight broke out at the diner that night, it wasn't entirely surprising to those who knew Ariel. They had seen him lose his temper before, and this time it seemed to have gone too far. Police wasted no time in naming Ariel as the primary suspect. The argument with Valentino, the gunshots in the alley, Ariel standing nearby in shock. It all painted a clear picture. Or so it seemed. Ariel didn't deny being at the scene. He admitted to arguing with Valentino, admitted to following him into the alley. But he denied the one thing that mattered most: pulling the trigger. "I didn't shoot him," he told the police during his initial interrogation. "I swear, I didn't do it." His claim didn't hold much weight at first. The evidence against him seemed damning. He was the last person seen with Valentino before the gunshots. Witnesses at the diner heard their argument. And when the police arrested him, Ariel didn't have much of an alibi. In fact, he barely spoke at all. Officers later described him as distant, withdrawn, almost as if he was in a state of shock. But there were pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. For one, the weapon used in the shooting was nowhere to be found. Police searched the alley, nearby dumpsters, and even questioned patrons at the diner, but the gun had seemingly vanished. Ariel didn't have it on him, and no one saw him dispose of it. Then there was the lack of gunshot residue on Ariel's hands or clothes. Forensic experts explained that it wasn't impossible for someone to fire a gun and avoid getting residue on them, but it was unusual, especially in a close-range shooting like this one. And there was something else. Ariel's behavior during his arrest didn't match the profile of someone who had just committed murder. Yes, he was nervous and shaky, but it wasn't the kind of nervousness you'd expect from someone trying to cover their tracks. It was more like fear. Fear of what had just happened. Fear of what was coming next. Still, the police didn't have the luxury of entertaining doubts. A boy was dead, and someone had to pay for it. Ariel Collins was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was booked into a juvenile detention center to await trial, and the town was left reeling. How had things escalated so quickly? How had an argument between two teenage boys ended with one of them dead? But as days turned into weeks, rumors began to circulate. Whispers around town hinted that Ariel's story might not be as far-fetched as it sounded. Some questioned the timeline of events. Others speculated about who else might have been at the diner that night. And then there were the hushed conversations about Ariel's mother, Penelope Morton. She had been at the diner earlier that evening, sitting at a table near the back. Several witnesses confirmed seeing her there. But what no one could explain was why Penelope had stayed so quiet in the aftermath of the shooting. She hadn't rushed to her son's defense. She hadn't spoken publicly about the case at all. It was as if she was trying to fade into the background, even as her family's life fell apart. As investigators continued their work, they began to uncover pieces of a story far more complicated than they had initially imagined. Ariel Collins might have been hot-headed, impulsive, and protective to a fault. But was he capable of murder? Or was he being used as a scapegoat in a crime that went far beyond a simple teenage argument? Penelope Morton was the kind of mother everyone in the neighborhood knew, whether they liked her or not. At 49 years old, she had built a reputation as a fiercely protective single mom who would stop at nothing to shield her children from harm. She was opinionated, outspoken, and sometimes overbearing, but she made it clear to anyone who crossed her path that her family came first. She ran a tight ship, said a neighbor who had lived down the street from the Mortons for years. Penelope didn't just love her kids. She controlled them. Everything went through her. Everything. Raising two teenagers on her own hadn't been easy for Penelope. After her husband left the family years earlier, she took on the role of both mother and father to Alani and Ariel. But that role didn't just come with love and support. It came with rules, lots of them. Alani and Ariel's friends would joke that Penelope was more like a drill sergeant than a mom. She wanted to know where they were at all times, who they were with, and what they were doing. She said it was because she cared, recalled Alani's best friend, Kinsley Pittman. But sometimes it felt like she didn't trust them. Like she always thought the worst could happen if she wasn't in control. That control extended especially to Alani. Penelope had always been wary of the people her daughter brought into her life, but her feelings about Valentino Harris were different. She didn't just disapprove of him. She actively disliked him. Friends of the family said Penelope often complained about Valentino's influence over Alani, claiming he was taking her down the wrong path. She'd tell anyone who would listen that Valentino was a distraction, that he was ruining Alani's future. At one point, she even tried to forbid Alani from seeing him, but as any teenager would, Alani didn't listen. Those closest to the family described the tension in the house as unbearable in the weeks leading up to Valentino's death. Arguments between Penelope and Alani had become more frequent, with Valentino often being the center of the conflict. "It got bad," said one family friend. Penelope wasn't just worried about Alani's relationship with Valentino. She was angry about it. Like really, really angry. I don't know if it was because she felt like she was losing control or if it was something else, but she couldn't stand him. On the night of March 4th, Penelope was at the same diner as her children. According to witnesses, she had arrived about 20 minutes before Valentino, Alani, and Ariel. She sat at a booth near the back, sipping coffee and occasionally glancing toward the door. When her children arrived, Penelope didn't join them at their table, but those who noticed her said it was clear she was keeping a close eye on them. What Penelope did in those moments before the tragedy unfolded is still unclear. Some say she was quietly watching, while others claimed she looked visibly tense, almost as if she were waiting for something. What is clear, however, is that when the argument between Ariel and Valentino broke out, Penelope didn't intervene. She stayed seated, letting things escalate until the boys walked out into the alley. Then, witnesses say, Penelope got up, paid her bill, and walked out of the diner. At first, no one connected her presence that night to the crime. She wasn't questioned by police, and she didn't offer any information on her own. But weeks after Ariel's arrest, new witnesses came forward with claims that changed everything. One witness, a diner employee who had been taking out the trash that night, told police that they saw a woman, later identified as Penelope, standing near the edge of the alley just before the gunshots were fired. Another witness, who had been sitting in their car across the street, claimed they saw a woman matching Penelope's description running away from the alley moments after the shots were heard. These statements prompted investigators to revisit the evidence, and what they found raised even more questions. Surveillance footage from a camera mounted on a nearby store showed Penelope leaving the diner at the exact time of the shooting. The footage didn't capture the alley itself, but it clearly showed her heading in that direction. Just minutes later, she was seen walking briskly back toward her car and driving off. Investigators also took another look at the physical evidence, or lack thereof. The missing murder weapon was still unaccounted for, but the possibility that Penelope might have taken it with her after the shooting suddenly seemed very real. Forensics teams searched her car and home but found no trace of the gun. Still, the circumstantial evidence against her was mounting. Then came the bombshell. During an interview with police, Ariel finally broke his silence. In a moment of desperation, he told investigators that his mother was the one who had pulled the trigger. According to Ariel, Penelope had followed him and Valentino into the alley. When the argument between the boys reached its peak, Penelope stepped in, not to break it up, but to end it. Ariel claimed that Penelope believed Valentino was a bad influence on Alani and that she had been determined to remove him from their lives. She told me to keep quiet, Ariel said. She said no one would believe me, and if I took the blame, I wouldn't get in as much trouble because I'm a kid. Ariel's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. Could it really be true? Had Penelope orchestrated the entire thing, knowing her son would take the fall? The pieces were starting to fit together, but investigators knew they needed more. They began building a case against Penelope, digging deeper into her actions before, during, and after the murder. What they found was a disturbing portrait of a woman who would do anything to maintain control over her family. Penelope had been furious about Alani's relationship with Valentino, but what investigators wanted to know was whether her anger alone had driven her to murder, or if there was another secret she was trying to protect. The case against Penelope was far from open and shut, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Ariel Collins wasn't the only person with blood on his hands. And for the first time since Valentino's death, the focus of the investigation shifted, not just toward justice, but toward uncovering the truth about a mother's darkest secret. Penelope Morton's hatred for Valentino Harris had always been an open secret. Friends of the family, neighbors, even Valentino himself knew that Penelope disapproved of his relationship with Alani. To her, Valentino wasn't just a distraction for her daughter, he was a threat. At first, people assumed her disdain came from a place of overprotectiveness, a mother who didn't think any boy was good enough for her child. But as investigators dug deeper into her life, they began to realize that Penelope's motives ran far deeper and far darker than anyone could have imagined. Witnesses who knew the family described Penelope's behavior toward Valentino as hostile. She would openly criticize him in front of others, often making sly remarks about his character or his future. According to Alani's close friend, Kinsley Pittman, Penelope once told Alani outright that Valentino would ruin her life. Kinsley recalled overhearing a heated argument at the Morton house just weeks before the murder. She told Alani that Valentino wasn't good enough for her, that he'd never amount to anything. But it wasn't just about him being a bad boyfriend. It was almost like she was afraid of him. That fear, investigators discovered, wasn't entirely unfounded. Valentino, for all his charm and kindness, had stumbled upon something he was never supposed to see. Penelope, as it turned out, had been hiding a secret. The details of that secret were murky at first. Rumors swirled about everything from financial fraud to an affair, but one thing became clear. Whatever Valentino had discovered, it was enough to make Penelope feel threatened. Through interviews with Valentino's close friends, police pieced together a chilling possibility. According to his best friend, Adon Case, Valentino had confided in him about something strange he'd seen during a visit to the Morton house. He didn't say much, Adon told investigators, just that he saw something in Penelope's room, papers or something she didn't want anyone to see. He said she freaked out when she realized he'd been in there. Like, really freaked out. This revelation put a new spin on the events leading up to the murder. Valentino wasn't just an unwanted boyfriend, he had become a liability. And for someone like Penelope, who thrived on control, a liability couldn't be tolerated. The turning point in the investigation came when Ariel, after weeks of silence, finally broke down during an interview. At first, he stuck to the same story he'd been telling since the night of the shooting, that he and Valentino had gotten into a fight, that things escalated, and that Valentino had ended up dead. But under pressure, Ariel's version of events began to unravel. What started as a few inconsistencies turned into a full confession, one that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Ariel admitted that he hadn't fired the gun. In fact, he claimed he never even saw the gun until it was too late. According to Ariel, it was Penelope who followed them into the alley that night. She had been watching from the diner, waiting for the argument to reach its peak. And when it did, she stepped in not to break it up, but to end it. She was the one who shot him, Ariel said, his voice trembling. I didn't know what she was going to do. I thought she was just going to yell at him, maybe pull me away or something. But then she pulled out the gun and... He paused, his words catching in his throat. She told me not to say anything. She said it would be easier if I just took the blame. Ariel's confession painted a devastating picture of what had happened that night. Penelope had orchestrated the entire thing, using her son as a pawn in her plan to silence Valentino once and for all. She knew the legal system better than most. She knew that if Ariel, a 16-year-old, were charged with the crime, he'd face a far lighter sentence than she would as an adult. To her, it was a calculated risk, one she believed she could control. Ariel explained that his mother had convinced him to keep quiet by preying on his fear and guilt. She told him that no one would believe the truth, that everyone would assume he was the killer anyway because of his temper and past behavior. And in a twisted way, Ariel believed her. I didn't want to go to jail, he said. But I didn't want her to go either. She's my mom. I didn't know what else to do. When investigators confronted Penelope with Ariel's confession, she denied everything. She claimed her son was lying to protect himself, that he was trying to shift the blame onto her because he couldn't handle the consequences of his actions. But by this point, the evidence against her was becoming impossible to ignore. The surveillance footage showing Penelope leaving the diner at the exact time of the shooting, the witness statements placing her near the alley, Ariel's confession, and the missing gun, which investigators believed Penelope had taken with her and disposed of after the crime. It all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Penelope Morton had not only killed Valentino Harris, but had also manipulated her own son into taking the fall. For investigators, the case was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about unraveling the web of lies Penelope had spun to protect herself. And as they prepared to bring charges against her, one question lingered. What other secrets was Penelope hiding? Ariel's confession turned the tide of the investigation, but it also left behind a wake of devastation. He was still a boy, barely old enough to drive, yet he had been forced to carry the weight of a crime he didn't commit. Valentino's family, meanwhile, was left grappling with the truth about what had happened to their son. And the community, once so quick to judge Ariel, now found themselves questioning how far a mother could go to protect her secrets and destroy her family in the process. Penelope Morton's carefully constructed web of lies began to crumble the moment her son, Ariel, told the truth. His testimony was devastating, both in its content and in the way it exposed the depth of Penelope's betrayal. She had not only taken the life of Valentino Harris, a boy whose only crime was falling in love with her daughter, but she had also tried to destroy her own son's future to cover her tracks. And now the time had come for justice. Penelope was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The evidence against her, which had once been fragmented and circumstantial, now painted a clear and damning picture. The surveillance footage, the witness statements, and Ariel's confession all pointed to her as the true killer. Investigators also discovered troubling details about her actions in the days following the murder. She had disposed of the weapon, avoided the police, and even coached her son on how to stick to their fabricated story. In court, the atmosphere was tense. Family members of both Valentino and Penelope filled the seats, their faces etched with grief, anger, and disbelief. Alani Beale sat quietly in the front row, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of Valentino. She had already lost the boy she loved, and now she was being forced to confront the reality of her mother's actions. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the case against Penelope. They described her as a controlling and manipulative woman who saw Valentino as a threat, not just to her daughter's future, but to her own carefully guarded secrets. Witnesses testified about her disdain for Valentino, recalling how she openly criticized him and tried to sabotage his relationship with Alani. The surveillance footage was shown to the jury, depicting Penelope leaving the diner and heading toward the alley just moments before the gunshots rang out. But the most compelling moment came when Ariel Collins took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he walked to the witness box. His shoulders slumped under the weight of what he was about to do. Ariel was just 16, but his words carried the gravity of someone far older. In a trembling voice, he recounted the events of that night in excruciating detail. He spoke about the argument with Valentino, how it had started inside the diner and escalated into the alley. He described the moment his mother appeared, how she had pulled out the gun and shot Valentino without hesitation. He explained how she had convinced him to take the blame, playing on his fear and his loyalty to her. "I didn't know what to do," Ariel said, his voice breaking. "She's my mom. I thought I had to protect her, but she used me. She used me to save herself." Ariel's testimony was the final nail in the coffin for Penelope's defense. The jury watched as his emotions poured out, raw and unfiltered. His pain was undeniable, and so was his truth. For Valentino's family, it was a bittersweet moment. They finally had the answers they had been waiting for, but those answers brought little comfort. Valentino was still gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Penelope eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs as the judge read the sentence. Up to 18 years in prison. It was a moment of accountability, but it came at a heavy cost. Ariel, too, had to face the consequences of his involvement. While the court acknowledged that he had been manipulated by his mother, he still bore some responsibility for his actions. Ariel pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and a felony assault charge. He was sentenced to serve time in a juvenile detention center until his 21st birthday. It was a more lenient punishment than he might have received if he had stayed silent, but it was still a harsh reality for a boy who had been caught in the crossfire of his mother's actions. As the sentencing hearing concluded, the emotional toll on the family was impossible to ignore. Valentino's mother, Gracie Sherman, wept quietly in the gallery, clutching her son's high school graduation photo. Alani, sitting just a few rows away, seemed frozen in place. Her tears had long since dried, leaving only a hollow expression of disbelief. How had her life unraveled so completely in just a few short months? After the hearing, Alani gave a brief statement to reporters. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of her grief. "I lost the love of my life, and now I've lost my mother too," she said. "I don't know how to move forward from this, but I hope Valentino can rest in peace knowing that the truth finally came out." For the small New Mexico town where the tragedy unfolded, the case left a lasting scar. Valentino's death, and the revelations that followed, exposed just how far one person could go to protect their secrets, and how devastating the consequences could be. Penelope's actions didn't just end Valentino's life. They shattered her family, destroyed her son's future, and left a community grappling with questions that may never truly be answered. In the end, there were no winners. Justice had been served, but the cost was unbearable. Valentino's family was left to mourn the loss of a boy who had so much potential, while Alani and Ariel were left to pick up the pieces of a life that would never be the same. And for Penelope Morton, her attempts to control everything had only led to her losing everything. After months of investigation, courtroom battles, and shocking revelations, the case of Valentino Harris's murder came to an end. But for those who lived through it, the pain and trauma were just beginning. The sentencing of Penelope Morton brought a sense of closure, but it also left behind a family shattered beyond repair. Penelope faced up to 18 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree murder. As the judge read her sentence, Penelope stood motionless, her face a mask of indifference. But those who knew her couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she remorseful, regretful, or was she still clinging to the belief that what she had done was justified? For Ariel Collins, the fallout was just as heavy. At only 16 years old, he had already experienced more than most people could imagine. He had been manipulated, betrayed, and thrust into the spotlight for a crime he didn't commit. But that didn't absolve him of his own role in the events of that night. His decision to go along with his mother's plan, even under her influence, came with consequences. Ariel was sentenced to remain in a youth detention center until his 21st birthday. It wasn't the same as an adult prison sentence, but it was still a harsh reality for a boy who had never fully understood the weight of what he had been drawn into. According to reports, Ariel spends his days attending therapy sessions and taking classes inside the facility, trying to piece his life back together. But those close to him say the guilt he carries is something no amount of time can erase. "He misses Valentino," said a family friend. "He talks about him a lot. I think he knows that even though he didn't pull the trigger, his actions still played a part in what happened. And that's something he'll carry with him forever." And then there was Alani Beale, the person caught in the middle of it all. She had lost so much. Her boyfriend, her mother, her family as she knew it. Those who know her describe a young woman struggling to make sense of her new reality. Once a bright and ambitious high school senior, Alani now spends most of her time at home, withdrawn from the world. Her dreams of going to college and pursuing a career seem to have faded, replaced by the weight of her grief. Friends who have tried to support her say it's been hard to reach her. "She's not the same person she was before," said Kinsley Pittman, Alani's best friend. "She used to laugh all the time, make plans for the future. Now she's just quiet. It's like a part of her died with Valentino." Alani's pain goes beyond the loss of Valentino. It's the betrayal by her own mother that has left scars that may never fully heal. "She trusted her mom," Kinsley continued. "She believed in her. And to find out that the person who was supposed to protect her was the one who caused all this. It's something she can't wrap her head around. None of us can." Gracie Sherman, a neighbor who had known the family for years, shared similar thoughts. Alani loved her mom. She looked up to her. And now, she's stuck with this burden, trying to figure out how to move forward while carrying all this pain. It's heartbreaking to watch. For Valentino's family, the aftermath has been equally devastating. His mother, Gracie Sherman, visits his grave every week, leaving flowers and talking to her son as if he could still hear her. "I just want him to know he's loved," she said in a rare interview. "I want him to know we'll never forget him, no matter how much time passes." The small New Mexico town where it all happened has also been left to pick up the pieces. For months, the case dominated headlines, dividing opinions and sparking heated debates. But now that it's over, the community is left with a lingering sadness. Valentino's death, and the betrayal that followed, served as a harsh reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed by violence and deception. As for Penelope, her life behind bars has been marked by isolation. Reports from the prison indicate that she rarely interacts with other inmates and keeps mostly to herself. "She doesn't talk about what she did," said a source. It's like she's trying to pretend it didn't happen. But she's not fooling anyone. In the end, the story of Valentino Harris, Ariel Collins, and Penelope Morton is one of loss. Loss of life, of innocence, of trust. For Alani, it's a story that will follow her forever, a weight she'll carry as she tries to rebuild her life. It's hard to explain what it's like to lose everything, Alani said in a rare statement to reporters. I lost Valentino. I lost my mom. I lost the person I used to be. I just hope that someday, somehow, I can find a way to heal. But right now, I'm just trying to survive. And for those left behind, survival is what it all comes down to. The tragedy of Valentino Harris's death may never truly fade. But for his family, Alani, and even Ariel, the hope is that one day they can find peace. Not just for themselves, but for the boy they lost. In the end, the story of Valentino Harris is more than just a tragic tale of a life cut far too short. It's a story about betrayal, the betrayal of trust, of love, and of family. It's a story about secrets, the kind that fester beneath the surface, tearing people apart from the inside out. And it's a story about the abuse of power. A mother who used her authority not to protect, but to control, with devastating consequences. Valentino was just 17 years old when his life was stolen. A boy with big dreams, a bright future, and a heart full of love for the people around him. His murder didn't just rob him of that future. It created ripples that forever altered the lives of everyone connected to him. Alani lost the love of her life and the mother she once trusted. Ariel, caught in a web he couldn't escape, will carry the scars of his mother's manipulation for the rest of his life. And Valentino's family will never stop grieving the boy they'll never get to see grow into the man he was meant to be. This case is a stark reminder of how violence and deception can spiral out of control, leaving nothing but heartbreak in their wake. It raises questions that may never have clear answers. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a moment when things could have gone differently? And how do those left behind begin to pick up the pieces after such unimaginable loss? While justice was ultimately served, it came at an unbearable cost. Valentino is gone, and nothing can bring him back. But what remains is a memory, a legacy of a boy who touched so many lives in his short time here. His laugh, his kindness, his talent. They live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved him. As we reflect on this case, let it serve as a reminder of the importance of truth, love, and compassion. In a world so often filled with darkness, it's up to us to be the light, to protect those we love and to always strive for better, even in the face of hardship. If you've made it this far into the story, thank you for taking the time to remember Valentino and the lessons his story teaches us. If you want more stories like this, stories that explore the complexities of human behavior, the pursuit of justice, and the impact of the choices we make, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There's so much more to uncover, and we'd love for you to join us as we continue to share these powerful, thought-provoking stories. Until next time, take care of yourselves and those you love.